July 20th, 2000, Indian Harbour Beach, Florida. 22-year-old Tessa Morgan finished her late shift at the Harborline Grill, locked the back door, and called her mom. She said she'd be home in 20 minutes. She never came back. By dawn, her car sat in the driveway, her purse still on the table, and the front door stood open, rocking gently in the humid ocean breeze. No forced entry, no struggle, just silence. Detectives searched the shoreline and found a trail of odd details. A coil of rope with a rare pattern, a strip of white tape clinging with dog hair, and plastic grocery bags weighted with sand. Each clue stranger than the last. Yet none could answer the question that haunted the town. Where was Tessa? Weeks turned into months. Months into years. The case went cold, locked away in the archives like so many others. Until one ordinary afternoon, 13 years later, when new forensic technology uncovered something no one had seen before, a discovery that would finally expose what really happened beneath the tide. Now, for the first time, we're retracing the steps, revisiting the evidence, and revealing how one microscopic clue solved a mystery that refused to stay buried. Before we begin, tell us, where are you watching from tonight? Comment your city and state, hit subscribe, and turn on the bell, because here, every week, we bring forgotten stories back to light. The ocean moved in slow, steady breaths against the dark sand. The night air thick with salt and humidity. Streetlights hummed, and the quiet seemed almost staged, as if the whole town had pressed pause for a moment. In this sleepy corner of Florida, most nights passed without incident, carried away on the tide and lost to memory. But on this night, as the Harborline Grill's neon sign flickered out, Tessa Morgan was finishing her late shift. The kitchen was already quiet, the last fries cooling in the basket, and the cooks had vanished with quick goodbyes. Tessa lingered, stacking chairs, wiping down counters, her motions slow and methodical. Habit, not hurry. She was 22, with a softness in her manner, someone people described as gentle, the sort who brought in cupcakes for birthdays and offered rides home after closing. As she pushed open the heavy glass door, the air hit her, warm, thick, familiar. She reached for her phone, thumbed in her mother's number. "I'm heading back now, Mom. Don't wait up," she said, voice hushed, almost apologetic. The line crackled, her mother's response lost in static, but Tessa smiled anyway. It was just their routine. Outside, the parking lot was deserted except for a single, aging sedan under the amber pool of a street lamp. Tessa moved quickly, her footsteps muffled against cracked asphalt. Somewhere nearby, the ocean whispered, steady and indifferent. She pulled her keys from her purse, hesitated, glanced back at the restaurant one last time. At 2 a.m., a neighbor, half asleep, waiting for sleep to claim him, heard the dull roar of a car engine starting, then fading. It was the only sound breaking the silence before morning. But when the sun rose, Tessa's room was still empty. The front door of the house stood ajar, rocking gently with the breeze. Her purse, phone, and car were all there, untouched, as if she'd stepped out only for a moment. The air in the hallway held a trace of salt, sharper than usual, and the feeling that something had been disturbed. It didn't take long for worry to spread. Patricia, Tessa's mother, woke to the empty bed and the uneasy quiet. She called her daughter's name, her voice trembling as she checked each room, then the porch, then the street. There was no note, no sign of panic or struggle, just an absence that grew heavier with every hour. Neighbors emerged onto their lawns, drawn by police lights and the low murmur of anxious voices, Some remembered seeing Tessa the night before, her easy smile as she passed by. Others recalled only the open door, swinging in the wind. The town, small enough that everyone knew each other's routines, felt the shift immediately. Something had broken the pattern. Police arrived, cautious but alert. They dusted the doorway, scanned the street for tire marks, and questioned the neighbors, their notepads filling with details that felt both urgent and pointless. The ocean glimmered in the distance, indifferent to the commotion along its edge. As the hours ticked by, rumors began to circulate. Some whispered about her ex-boyfriend. Trouble there, people said, though no one seemed to know the whole story. Others wondered if Tessa had simply needed to disappear, to run from something Walto could see. But those who knew her best felt a different chill, the sense that something had gone wrong in the quietest, most ordinary way. By evening, Patricia sat on the porch, her face drawn and pale. She watched the horizon, as if it might give her back her daughter. The sky turned bruised purple and then black, the night pressing in once more. Inside the house, Tessa's belongings sat where she'd left them, a half-read paperback, the scent of her perfume, her favorite sandals kicked off by the door. But the emptiness was louder than all of it. No one could explain how, in a town where nothing ever happened, someone could vanish so completely. The only evidence was the open door and the heavy, salted air, and beneath the calm, the first ripple of fear began to spread, growing, gathering, waiting for the truth to surface. Tessa Morgan was the sort of person you remembered, even if you only met her once. She had a quietness that wasn't shyness, just a gentleness, an ability to listen that made people trust her with their stories, their secrets. Her eyes held the color of the sea at dawn, and she moved through life with a softness that made even the most hardened folks in Indian Harbour Beach pause and smile. She and her mother, Patricia, lived together in a weathered house at the edge of Indian River Lagoon. The place was modest, full of chipped mugs, faded photographs, and the scent of vanilla candles burning low. Tessa's room overlooked the water, its window always a little fogged from the salt air. At night, she'd sometimes press her palm against the glass, tracing invisible shapes, watching the way moonlight danced on the gentle waves. Despite growing up beside the water, Tessa had always been uneasy around it. She respected the sea's beauty, but stayed cautious, never learning to swim. Her friends teased her about it, but she'd just smile, shrug, and keep to the sand. She worked evenings at the Harborline Grill, bussing tables, carrying trays with the easy grace of someone who saw service as a kind of kindness. Regulars looked for her, families, fishermen, even the old-timers who didn't talk much to anyone else. She remembered their orders, their birthdays, the little things that made them feel seen. The tips weren't much, but she always brought home a bag of leftovers for her mother, and some nights she'd leave an extra dessert on a regular's plate with a quiet, "just because." Her mother worried about her, the way mothers do. Patricia was protective, hovering at the edge of Tessa's independence. She'd watch from the porch as Tessa left for work in the evenings, headlights sweeping across the driveway, and would often leave a lamp burning until she heard the door open again. The two shared a bond shaped by years of being just the two of them. No siblings, no father, just the echo of laughter and quiet routines. And then there was Evan Brooks. He was handsome, easy with a joke, a boat mechanic who could fix anything with a stubborn engine and charm his way out of a speeding ticket. When he and Tessa first got together, everyone said they made sense, opposites in all the right ways. For a time, he made her laugh, coaxed her out to bonfires and late-night drives by the coast. But beneath that charm, there was a restlessness in Evan, a need to possess what he loved. As months passed, their differences sharpened. Evan's smiles grew tighter, his temper more volatile. He became jealous, suspicious of Tessa's kindness to others, even to her coworkers or old high school friends. The calls started, sometimes pleading, sometimes angry. He'd show up outside the restaurant at closing, watching from across the street, his eyes never leaving her. Tessa tried to explain it away, telling her mother he was just struggling, that he needed time. But Patricia saw the way her daughter's hands trembled when her phone lit up late at night, the way Tessa flinched at unexpected knocks on the door. The breakup was quiet but final. Tessa handed Evan his things in a grocery bag on the front steps, her voice barely above a whisper. He begged her to reconsider. She shook her head, her resolve steady, but her eyes shining with regret for what might have been. After that, Evan drifted along the edges of her life, never close enough to force a confrontation, but always present, a car idling in the street, a text in the small hours, his shadow a constant reminder of a connection she no longer wanted. People in town talked, as small towns do. Evan just can't let her go, they said at the diner, shaking their heads. But no one thought it would go further than heartbreak. Tessa remained the girl who left cookies at the library, who brought her elderly neighbor groceries, who once coaxed a stray cat out from under the pier during a thunderstorm. She was everyone's friend, everyone's favorite, the kind of person who brightened a room by simply entering it. What they didn't see were the moments she spent standing by her bedroom window, looking out at the black water and trying to steady her breathing. They didn't see the messages she deleted, or the careful way she double-checked the locks each night. The fear crept in slowly, almost invisible, until it became just another part of her daily routine. Yet even as she struggled with uncertainty and unease, Tessa never stopped being herself. She remembered birthdays, checked in on friends, smiled at strangers. She kept living with an open heart, never letting bitterness change her, even as she carried burdens she rarely spoke of. The girl by the water, gentle, hopeful, a little afraid, had no idea how close the darkness was pressing in. She had no way of knowing that every gesture, every kindness, every smile was about to become a memory for those left behind, a light against the shadow that was soon to fall over Indian Harbour Beach. July 20th, 2000 began like any other sticky Florida summer night. Heat still rising off the roads, cicadas pulsing in the palmettos, and the ocean sighing under a fat, swollen moon. The day had drifted by with nothing unusual, but by midnight, a sense of unease was coiling through the narrow streets of Indian Harbour Beach. In homes lit only by blue TV screens, people fell asleep, never suspecting that before sunrise, the story of their town would change forever. It was just after 2:20 a.m. when Tessa's cell phone placed a single brief call to Evan Brooks. In the darkness of her room, her bedside lamp was still on, casting a small yellow pool across a heap of unfolded laundry and her favorite paperback. Whatever words were exchanged in those minutes are lost now, swallowed up in static and the vastness of the coming void. The call ended, and the world slipped into silence. By morning, the stillness was different, a heavy, waiting kind of silence. Patricia woke first, sensing something was wrong before she even opened her eyes. The lamp in the hallway still burned, and the front door, normally locked, hung open by a crack. Tessa's purse sat untouched on the side table, keys dropped haphazardly beside it. Her car, the old sedan she'd driven home from work, was parked in its usual spot, driver's seat pushed back, air inside already thick and stale from the rising sun. Patricia moved through the house, calling Tessa's name. There was no answer. In the kitchen, the leftovers from last night's dinner waited, uneaten. In Tessa's room, her bed was half slept in, the sheets kicked down, the window open just an inch to let in the river breeze. The ordinary sights of daily life, her camera on the desk, a guitar gathering dust in the corner, seemed suddenly foreign, as if their owner had simply been erased. At first, hope lingered. Maybe Tessa had stepped outside for air. Maybe she'd gone to meet a friend, or taken an early walk by the lagoon to clear her mind. But as the hours slipped by and calls went unanswered, hope turned to panic. Patricia reached out to neighbors, friends, anyone who might know something. The police arrived before noon, solemn and businesslike, asking for photographs and a list of contacts. They walked the perimeter of the house, eyes sharp for any sign, any clue that might break the patternless mystery of her absence. News spread, growing and mutating with every retelling. Someone had heard an engine late at night. Maybe Tessa's, maybe not. Another neighbor swore they'd seen a shadow in the yard, moving quickly, too quickly, and then gone. Theories flourished. Runaway, kidnapping, a lover's quarrel that spiraled out of control. But for all the whispers, there was nothing solid, nothing that could fill the hole left by Tessa's sudden disappearance. Days passed in a fever dream. Flyers went up in grocery stores, libraries, nailed to trees at the edge of the river. Her face, smiling, bright, stared back from every pole and bulletin board. Her name spoken in urgent tones at the post office and over kitchen tables. Volunteers fanned out to the marshes, the mangroves, even the derelict boatyards by the water, calling her name into the heavy, buzzing silence. Each evening, when hope was lowest, the searchers returned, muddy and exhausted, their hands empty. 3 days after she vanished, the town woke to a grisly rumor. A fisherman out on the Merritt Island Causeway had spotted something unnatural floating just beneath the surface, snagged among the pilings. The sheriff's department cordoned off the bridge, their cars crowding the shoulder as they leaned over the rails, peering down into the brackish water. It was her. Bound with coarse rope, white tape covering her head and mouth, and plastic grocery bags tied at her legs, the current had done its best to keep her hidden, rocking her gently beneath the pilings as if she might simply drift away, disappear forever. But the water gave her back, silent and implacable. She had been taken, silenced, and tucked beneath the tide with a cruelty that stunned even the most hardened officers. Forensic teams moved carefully, snapping photos, collecting fibers, piecing together the last moments of her life from the evidence the water had not washed away. The river, so familiar and constant, became a crime scene, its surface broken only by the slow, methodical sweep of searchlights and the distant wail of sirens. Word raced through town, each telling colder and sharper than the last. Patricia, numb with disbelief, was ushered away by police, her sobs echoing across the marsh. The fear that had been simmering beneath the surface now boiled over. Doors were locked tight, blinds drawn, children kept inside even as the heat pressed in from every window. In a place where people once left their keys in the ignition, a new paranoia took hold. The sense of safety, the small-town trust, evaporated overnight. And so the official version began to take shape, a timeline, a list of calls, a reconstruction of movements. But the truth of it was simpler and far more terrifying. One night, a gentle girl disappeared, as if the air itself had swallowed her whole. The ordinary fabric of life had been ripped open, leaving only the question that haunted every heart in Indian Harbour Beach. How could someone vanish so completely? Beneath the surface, the river kept its secrets, and above, in every house and every heart, the fear remained. An echo of loss, an unending question with no answer in sight. When the news finally broke, it rolled across Indian Harbour Beach like a slow, heavy wave, unstoppable, suffocating. There was no escaping it, not in the aisles of the grocery store, not in the church pews, not at the river's edge where Tessa's body had been found. A photograph of her, young, smiling, sunlight tangled in her hair, stared back from every television screen and newspaper, her story becoming the only thing anyone could talk about. Patricia, Tessa's mother, was the first to feel the true weight of it. She was brought to the morgue to identify her daughter, but as soon as she saw the small, pale hand beneath the sheet, she collapsed. Grief overwhelmed her in a way that no one could touch. Her cries echoed in sterile halls, the kind of sound that made even seasoned police officers look away. The moment she fell to her knees, it was as if all the air was sucked from the room. No one could find the words to make sense of such sorrow. She hated the water, Patricia choked out between sobs later. She was afraid of it her whole life. The irony was cruel, almost mocking. The one place Tessa feared most had become her final resting place. The shock radiated outward. The regulars at the Harborline Grill left flowers by the riverbank, their faces drawn, eyes rimmed red from sleepless nights. Young women who'd shared shifts with Tessa now spoke of nightmares, their sense of security shattered. Parents held their children a little tighter, walking them to school, warning them not to linger on the streets after dark. Indian Harbour Beach had always felt safe, like a small town wrapped in the gentle hush of the ocean. Now it felt exposed, raw, vulnerable, its innocence lost. The media descended with their vans and cameras, their questions sharp and relentless. The parking lot of the police station overflowed with strangers, reporters desperate for any new detail, any hint of scandal or drama. But the truth was simpler, more devastating. A young woman was gone, and nobody understood why. Neighbors gathered in small, silent groups, exchanging rumors and condolences. They replayed every moment, every small detail, searching for something they might have missed. Had someone seen a car parked where it shouldn't be? Had anyone noticed Evan Brooks, Tessa's ex, hanging around more than usual? The whispers circled endlessly, feeding off fear and uncertainty. The grief was communal, but it was also isolating. Each person carried their own version of the loss. Some left flowers, others prayers. A few pressed notes into Patricia's mailbox. Simple words, offering help or remembrance, none of which could fill the void. In the grocery store, cashiers worked in silence. In the diner, laughter seemed out of place. Conversations trailed off into uneasy silence. People moved slower, shoulders hunched against an invisible weight. The rhythms of daily life continued, but they had been altered, slowed by the undertow of collective mourning. Even those who had barely known Tessa felt the loss. She was the girl who'd once helped carry groceries to an old woman's car, the voice that called out, "Good night," as she biked home in the dusk, the quiet presence who left a flower on a forgotten grave. Now her absence lingered in every empty street and darkened window, At the heart of the town, the question pulsed: who could do something like this to Tessa? Suspicion simmered just below the surface, an undercurrent that eroded trust. Evan's name came up more often now, always in hushed tones. Some remembered how he'd watched her from across the street, how he'd seemed unable to let go. Still, no one dared say for sure. It was easier to be afraid than to accuse. As days turned into weeks, the first shock faded, replaced by a deep, aching sadness. The town had lost more than Tessa. They had lost their sense of safety, their belief in the predictability of life. The river, once a place of beauty and calm, had become a symbol of everything they feared. Flowers piled up on the bank, a growing tribute to the girl who had loved quietly and been loved in return. The pain remained, suspended in the thick summer air, as the community tried to find its footing in a world that no longer made sense. The investigation into Tessa Morgan's murder began with a sense of urgency that matched the town's anxiety. Detectives from the Brevard County Sheriff's Office arrived in force, their faces set, moving with quiet purpose through the beach house that once felt so safe. Their presence, their questions, their quiet notes, only confirmed what Patricia and her neighbors already knew. Something monstrous had happened here. The first hours were a storm of movement. Evidence technicians worked methodically through Tessa's bedroom and the front hallway, photographing everything, dusting for prints, collecting fibers that glimmered under their flashlights. The scent of salt water still lingered in the air, mingling with the acrid bite of fingerprint powder. Outside, officers canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on doors, seeking anyone who'd heard or seen the smallest detail in the silent hours of Tessa's disappearance. Detectives quickly focused their attention on Evan Brooks. He was the last person Tessa had called. Phone records showed a short conversation at 2:23 a.m., the final signal before she vanished. His reputation in town had changed since the breakup, and though he maintained he hadn't seen her that night, his alibi was thin. The questions came fast. Where were you? Did she reach out to you? Why did you drive past her house so many times last week? Evan led them to his small boat shed on the edge of the lagoon, a cluttered space that reeked of gasoline and old rope. In the corner, the investigators found a coil of rope with a rare double diamond pattern, distinct and matching what had been used to bind Tessa. Nearby sat a half-used roll of white duct tape, and stuck to its edges were a few coarse black dog hairs. Plastic grocery bags from Publix were crumpled in a corner, their handles twisted in knots almost identical to those found at the riverbank. It was the kind of evidence that didn't scream guilt, but whispered it, relentlessly, piece by piece. Still, there was no confession, no witness who'd seen Evan and Tessa together after her shift ended, and the case needed more. Something irrefutable, a thread that could not be broken. Forensic specialists worked late into the night. They examined the rope's weave, sending samples to the lab to confirm its uniqueness. The duct tape, too, was bagged and tagged, its sticky residue combed for fingerprints, skin cells, any biological trace. Even the black dog hairs became central to the inquiry. Detectives recalled that Evan's Rottweiler, Duke, had often accompanied him to the docks. Now those hairs might tie him to the crime scene. Meanwhile, officers pulled security footage from gas stations, traffic cameras, and nearby convenience stores, their eyes scanning for any glimpse of Tessa or Evan during the narrow window in which she disappeared. The timeline was reconstructed in agonizing detail. Tessa finished her shift and drove home. She made a brief call to Evan, and then nothing. No video, no witnesses, just a gap. A pocket of missing time in which something irreversible occurred. Interviews with friends and coworkers painted a complicated picture. Tessa had confided in some about Evan's persistence, his sudden appearances at her work and home, the late-night calls that left her shaken. Others remembered his anger after the breakup, the change in his demeanor, the way he lingered in the background, never quite out of sight. It wasn't enough for an arrest, but it was enough to make the entire town uneasy. The investigation took on a relentless pace. Detectives returned to the beach house again and again, searching for overlooked clues. They traced every purchase of rope and duct tape at local hardware stores, cross-checking receipts and security video. The team combed through Tessa's phone records, social media, emails, looking for any hint of another suspect, a secret, a motive missed in the initial shock. But every path seemed to loop back to Evan Brooks. The evidence was circumstantial but damning. The rope, the tape, the grocery bags, the history of obsession. Still, Evan refused to crack under questioning. He sat in the interview room, jaw clenched, voice low, insisting he only wanted to talk to Tessa that night, that he hadn't left his house after midnight. The investigators pressed him, cycling through theory after theory, trying to catch him in a lie, but he remained stone-faced, never wavering from his story. The case moved forward on pressure and persistence. Forensic results began to trickle in. The rope's double diamond pattern was rare, but not unique. The duct tape was a common brand, sold in dozens of stores. The dog hairs, without DNA testing that didn't yet exist, could only suggest, not prove, a connection. There was no smoking gun, just a chorus of details that together drew the net tighter and tighter around Evan. But as summer stretched on and the media's interest faded, the case hit a wall. The physical evidence was compelling, but not definitive. Without DNA, without an eyewitness, without a confession, the prosecution was hesitant to bring charges that might not stick. Files began to stack up in the sheriff's office. Reports, photos, evidence logs, until they formed a heavy, silent archive of everything that could not bring Tessa back. In the end, Indian Harbour Beach was left in limbo. Evan remained free, his presence in town a constant, bitter reminder of what the investigation could not prove. The detectives, frustrated and restless, kept their files open and their hopes alive, waiting for a break that never seemed to come. For Patricia and the rest of the community, the pain of unanswered questions grew sharper with each passing day. And so, the search for justice slowed, but never stopped, a shadow lingering at the water's edge, waiting for the day when the truth would finally surface. By the winter of 2001, the Tessa Morgan case had faded from the headlines. The town that once pulsed with search parties, interviews, and whispered speculation had settled back into its uneasy routines. The yellow police tape at the riverbank was long gone, and the bouquet of flowers left in Tessa's memory wilted under the Florida sun until only brittle stems remained. But inside Patricia Morgan's home, time moved differently. Slower, heavier, each day a quiet echo of the last. The file marked Tessa Morgan, suspicious death, was boxed, sealed, and placed on a shelf deep in the sheriff's office archives. Detectives moved on to new cases, but the silence left behind by the unsolved murder weighed on them. Every now and then, someone would walk past the file and pause, tracing the faded label with a finger, remembering the girl with the gentle smile who had vanished so violently. Patricia's world shrank to the walls of her house. She stopped going out except for groceries, moving through stores like a shadow. She kept Tessa's room exactly as it was: the unmade bed, the guitar by the window, the mirror still covered in notes and photographs. She could not bear to move even the smallest thing. Some nights, she'd sit in the dark on the edge of her daughter's bed, listening to the sound of the waves rolling in, her mind playing the last words they'd shared over and over. Every detail became sacred. The way Tessa laughed, the pattern on her favorite mug, the sweet tang of her perfume that still lingered faintly in the closet. Each July 20th, Patricia would walk down to the river and leave fresh flowers at the spot where her daughter was found. She stood in the early morning mist, feeling the damp air settle on her skin, waiting for a sign that would never come. Sometimes she'd see other mothers, strangers, pausing by the small memorial, their faces soft with understanding. They would nod in solidarity, a silent acknowledgement of loss and endurance. For years, Patricia called the sheriff's office on the anniversary of Tessa's death, her voice hopeful, then resigned, always asking the same question. Is there anything new? The answer was always the same. No, ma'am. Nothing yet. It became a ritual, a way to keep her daughter's memory alive and to remind the world that Tessa had not been forgotten. But each passing year chipped away at that hope, leaving only fatigue and the ache of things unfinished. The world outside kept spinning faster and faster. Neighbors moved away. New families arrived, unaware of the history heavy in the air. The town rebuilt its sense of normalcy, but Patricia noticed the small changes. Parents more cautious, locks on doors tightened, children kept close at dusk. Indian Harbour Beach would never be as innocent again. Evan Brooks, the man at the center of every suspicion, faded into the background. He kept to himself, avoided old haunts, and grew older in the shadows. Some believed his silence was guilt, others that it was simply the only way to survive in a town that could never forgive or forget. No new evidence surfaced, no confessions whispered in the dark. The case seemed to dissolve into the endless, shifting tide. What lingered was absence. Patricia's grief settled in her bones, coloring every moment with longing and regret. She learned to live with the silence and with the questions that circled endlessly but never landed. The passage of time dulled the sharpest edges of pain, but nothing could fill the space where her daughter should have been. Some nights, when the house was impossibly quiet, Patricia would light a candle and sit by the window, watching the moon shimmer over the water. In those long hours before dawn, hope felt both foolish and necessary. She whispered Tessa's name to the dark, promising never to let her go no matter how many years might pass. And so the world moved on, slowly, inexorably. The Morgan house remained frozen in a moment of loss, a silent witness to a tragedy that had become a cold case. But Patricia held her vigil, year after year, believing that the truth would one day find its way back, even if it took a lifetime for the river to give up all its secrets. 13 years after Tessa Morgan's death, the Morgan house still wore its grief in the quietest ways. Dust gathered on picture frames, and every July the same bouquet of lilies wilted on the riverbank. The file on Tessa's murder sat in the county archives, yellowed and silent, as cold as the day it had been closed. For the police, it was one of those unsolved cases that slipped into legend, spoken of in training rooms and late-night conversations, but rarely revisited with hope. But in the spring of 2013, a new detective, Ryan Keller, transferred to Brevard County. He was young, meticulous, with a mind tuned to the smallest detail and a belief that no case was ever truly dead. As part of a push to re-examine old evidence, Ryan pulled the Morgan file and began the painstaking work of rereading every interview, every forensic report, every faded Polaroid. It was there, in the margins of an old evidence log, that he found a line others had skimmed over 100 times. Unidentified animal hairs, black, coarse, found adhered to duct tape. In 2000, it had been a dead end. Forensics could identify the hairs as canine, but not much else. The technology just hadn't existed to go further. But now, in 2013, mitochondrial DNA analysis had transformed what was possible. Dog hair could be tested and matched, just as human DNA could. Ryan sent the samples to the state crime lab, the process slow and fragile, every step dependent on the care with which the old evidence had been preserved. He waited, following up every week, his anticipation mounting. At the same time, he revisited interviews and crime scene photos, returning again and again to the details of Evan Brooks, the ex-boyfriend with a history of jealousy, the man who lived alone at the edge of the lagoon, the one who owned a Rottweiler named Duke, always at his side in those days after Tessa disappeared. Duke, people recalled, had gone missing not long after the murder. Some said Evan claimed the dog ran off. Others wondered if it was just another thread in a tangled knot of secrets. In 2000, it hadn't mattered much. In 2013, the answer could break the case wide open. When the lab results finally came in, the match was clear. The mitochondrial DNA in the black dog hairs found on the tape at the crime scene belonged to Duke, Evan Brooks's Rottweiler. For the first time, science linked the physical evidence directly to the suspect's inner circle, weaving together the rope, the tape, and the silent presence of the dog that had once followed Evan everywhere. Ryan's adrenaline surged. He pored over the property records and old search logs, noting that the original sweep of Evan's boat, shed, and yard had been thorough, but perhaps not exhaustive. Over the years, things had shifted. Old fuel drums moved, piles of fishing nets rearranged, junk slowly accumulating in corners. It was possible, Ryan thought, that something had been missed, tucked away with the confidence of someone who thought the world had forgotten. He returned to the Brooks property with a warrant and a small forensic team. The house was quiet, Evan older now, hollowed by time and suspicion, his movements slow and watchful. In the shed, behind rusted fuel drums and piles of old tarps, they found what they hadn't known to look for all those years before, a hidden coil of rope, patterned in the same rare double diamond weave as the one that had bound Tessa. It was dirty and stiff with age, but unmistakable in its design. They logged and photographed every inch, bagged it for analysis, and left nothing undisturbed. The investigation, once stagnant, exploded to life. Detectives re-interviewed witnesses who had aged a decade, memories sharpened by time and the gravity of what had been missed. Friends remembered Duke's sudden disappearance, recalled Evan burning old clothes in his yard after Tessa's funeral. Old co-workers of Tessa's described her fear in more vivid detail now, their words tinged with guilt and the sharpness of hindsight. Patricia, after all these years, was called back to the police station. Her hope rekindled, trembling on the edge of disbelief and exhaustion. Piece by piece, the cold case turned hot. The evidence, once just a chorus of quiet suggestions, now formed a single, undeniable narrative. The dog hair, the rope, the tape, the patterns of behavior, the history of obsession. Modern forensics had closed a circle that old-fashioned policing never could. Evan Brooks was arrested, his silence finally broken by the weight of what he could no longer outrun. As the cuffs clicked shut, The whole town seemed to hold its breath. Justice, long denied, felt suddenly close, as if the air itself had shifted. For the first time in 13 years, Patricia allowed herself to believe the river might finally release its secrets, and that her daughter's story might yet end with truth. The trial of Evan Brooks began in the spring of 2014, almost 14 years after Tessa's murder. For most in Indian Harbour Beach, justice had felt impossibly distant, a cold comfort that faded with each passing year. But now, as the courthouse doors swung open and the small courtroom filled with reporters, old friends, and neighbors who still remembered Tessa's laugh, hope returned, a sudden, bright force against years of numbness. Patricia sat in the front row, hands knotted tightly in her lap, every muscle drawn with tension. She was older now, the grief etched into her skin, but her eyes were unyielding. She had waited for this day longer than anyone, surviving on ritual and memory, holding to the faith that the truth would one day win out. Around her, townspeople gathered not just for Tessa, but for all the quiet losses, all the unanswered questions that had shadowed their lives since the summer of 2000. The prosecution built its case meticulously, a drumbeat of evidence that drew a straight, relentless line from Evan to the crime. The rope with the rare double diamond weave, matched to the coil found on his property. The roll of white duct tape with black Rottweiler hairs still stuck in its fibers. The plastic Publix grocery bags, their pattern identical to those used in the attempt to weigh Tessa down. Most damning of all was the dog hair, the link to Duke, the missing companion who had been everywhere with Evan until the weeks after Tessa's body was found. Modern forensic science transformed what had once been circumstantial details into a precise, unbreakable chain. Experts took the stand to explain the mitochondrial DNA match, making clear that the hairs on the tape could only have come from Duke. Every fragment of physical evidence, every silent witness from the past, now spoke with authority in the present. The defense tried to sow doubt. Evan's attorney called the evidence a web of coincidences, suggested contamination, even pointed to the absence of direct eyewitnesses or a confession. But the prosecution pressed forward, reminding the jury that justice is not always immediate, but the truth endures. The story was simple, chilling. Love had turned to obsession, and obsession to violence. As testimony unfolded, the contrast in the courtroom was striking. The machinery of justice moved with speed and certainty, in stark opposition to the years of agony and slow-motion heartbreak that Patricia and her community had endured. For so long, they had waited in silence, their pain private and unspoken. Now every detail was laid bare, each knot in the rope, every call Tessa made, every step Evan took in the weeks before the murder, exposed under the harsh lights of justice. The trial lasted just over a week. The jury was out for 3 hours. When the verdict was read, guilty on all counts, the room erupted not in cheers but in tears, a long exhale after years of holding breath. Patricia wept, her shoulders shaking as the judge delivered Evan Brooks's sentence. Life in prison, no parole. After 14 years, the man who had haunted her dreams, who had stolen her daughter, was finally rendered powerless by the law. Outside, the media caught the moment. Patricia clutching a photograph of Tessa, neighbors embracing, detectives exchanging weary, relieved looks. For many, it was a moment of catharsis. For others, a bittersweet victory. Nothing could bring Tessa back, But justice, delayed, resisted, and finally undeniable, had arrived. The news rippled out from Indian Harbour Beach, carried by headlines and nightly broadcasts. The story became more than a local tragedy. It was proof that patience, love, and tenacity could overcome even the longest darkness. For cold case detectives across the country, it was a banner for the power of forensic science and a promise that the past could never be fully buried. In the weeks that followed, Patricia visited the riverbank again. This time, the flowers she left were a tribute not just to loss, but to a promise kept. She whispered goodbye to Tessa beneath the open sky. The burden lightened, if only a little. All around her, the community that had grieved in silence began to heal, voices rising with the knowledge that the truth, once hidden beneath the tide, had finally come ashore. Long after the trial ended and the media faded away, the town of Indian Harbour Beach moved forward with a quiet that felt both hard-won and haunted. Some things returned to normal. Children rode bikes past the Harborline Grill, old fishermen cast lines from the pier, and beachgoers strolled along the edge of the water, letting the surf cool their feet. Yet in subtle ways, the town was forever changed, marked by the echo of a crime and the memory of a girl who would always remain 22. At the river's edge, just off a quiet walking trail shaded by mangroves, there stood a small, simple sign. Its white paint, gently chipped by sun and rain, bore the words, "In memory of Tessa Morgan, the river remembers." People came here in the early mornings and late afternoons, sometimes leaving wildflowers or handwritten notes, sometimes just sitting in silence. For some, it was a place to grieve. For others, it was a warning, a reminder that the line between safety and tragedy can be as thin as a door left open in the night. The river moved as it always had, constant, uncaring, beautiful, but it now carried a shadow, a quiet weight beneath the surface. For Patricia, healing came slowly, if it came at all. Her days were no longer filled with calls to the sheriff's office, no longer punctuated by the desperate hope for answers. The house still held Tessa's laughter in the walls, her perfume in the closet, her shoes by the door. Patricia took comfort in her rituals, tending the memorial, talking to her daughter in the quiet hours before dawn, lighting a candle and watching its reflection shimmer on the windowpane. Sometimes, she would dream of Tessa walking by the river, barefoot and smiling, finally at peace. Around town, people spoke of Tessa's story in lowered voices. Some shared it with their daughters, warning them to trust their instincts, to speak up about fear, to guard their hearts, but never let kindness become vulnerability. Teachers at the local high school kept her photograph pinned to a bulletin board in the guidance office, a silent lesson in the importance of listening, of watching for signs that someone might be in trouble. The past became part of the town's fabric, woven into every cautious glance, every act of care and community. Indian Harbour Beach learned to live with the aftermath. The suspicion that once divided neighbors softened over time, replaced by the gentle understanding that everyone had lost something. On the anniversary of Tessa's death, the community gathered by the water. There were no speeches, no fanfare, just a moment of shared silence, the sound of wind in the reeds and the quiet plash of fish breaking the surface. People left candles, drawings, messages scrawled on river stones. Some wept. Others smiled, remembering a kindness, a joke, a moment when Tessa had made their world a little brighter. The tragedy became something more than a cautionary tale, It became a call to vigilance, a plea for empathy. Tessa's life, and her loss, inspired a renewed commitment to watchfulness and compassion. Friendships were cherished more fiercely, and parents listened more closely. For the young women of the town, her story was both a shield and a beacon, a reminder of danger, yes, but also of resilience and the right to be heard. And yet, the river kept its secrets. At sunset, it glowed gold and blue, the water calm, as if nothing had ever disturbed it. But those who paused at Tessa's sign knew that beneath its surface, the current remembered everything: the fear, the loss, the quiet acts of love that followed. It remembered the girl who had once been afraid of its depths, and the town that had learned, too late, to fear the silence. Tessa's story endured not just in court records and news clippings, but in every cautious gesture, every bouquet of flowers left by the water, every mother who kept an extra light burning in the window. The river's memory became the town's own, a living tribute to a life interrupted, a promise that silence would never again be mistaken for safety. And as the years drifted on, the town never forgot. The river remembered. The story of Tessa Morgan began as a quiet life by the water, shaped by ordinary kindness and youthful hope, and ended as a chapter in the ongoing chronicle of loss and resilience. But even after the headlines faded, even as the years slipped by and the town of Indian Harbour Beach stitched itself back together, her memory endured. More than a name, more than a case, more than a cautionary tale. Tessa's tragedy, drawn from the real case of Misty April Morse, reverberates beyond a single night in the summer of 2000. Misty, like Tessa, was a daughter, a friend, a gentle soul whose life was stolen and hidden beneath the waters of the Indian River Lagoon. For years, her family lived with the agony of unanswered questions and the ache of unresolved grief. It took patience, perseverance, and a relentless search for the truth to finally bring justice, using science that hadn't even existed when the crime occurred. Dog hair, once dismissed as inconsequential, became the key that unlocked a silent, stubborn mystery. This story is not only about loss, but also about what remains. Love that outlasts violence, hope that persists even in darkness, and a community's promise to never look away. It is about mothers who keep vigil, detectives who refuse to give up, and neighbors who remember. For every unsolved case, every voice silenced by fear, there are those who continue the search, because the truth matters, and because remembrance is a form of resistance against forgetting. Tessa's story warns us of the dangers that can grow from control, isolation, and unchecked obsession. It reminds us that love, when twisted by fear and power, becomes something else entirely. The lesson is both stark and vital. If you ever feel threatened or isolated, reach out. Silence is the enemy of safety. Secrets, kept out of fear, shame, or disbelief, can protect the wrong person and leave the vulnerable at risk. Let this story be a call to action. If you sense something is wrong, for yourself or for someone you love, speak up. Trust your instincts. Reach out to friends, to family, to authorities. Communities are strongest when they care, when they watch over each other, when they listen without judgment, and offer help without hesitation. As the sun sets over the Indian River, the water returns to its old rhythm, gentle, persistent, eternal. The ripples fade, but the memory lingers. Tessa's life and Misty's remind us that every act of remembrance, every effort to seek justice carries forward into the world. It is how wounds begin to heal, how futures are changed, how we honor those we have lost. For the families still waiting, for the voices still unheard, there is work to be done. The tide may keep its secrets, but the search for truth endures, and in the hush after the story ends, there is hope.